Hello everyone, good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, a good friend and colleague, Vlad Stukov. We've known each other for years. I'm not going to say how many years.
You can.
No, I want us to be young, at least young at heart. I'm delighted that we were able to take the opportunity of ASSI's convention attracting colleagues from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean to bring them here. So right before ASSI's convention, we had Professor Dirk Uffelmann from Germany, from the University of Passau. And right after the convention, we now have Professor Stukov. He gave another talk yesterday at the Hall Center, which is focused on one of the prominent topics of his research, which is Russian cinema. In fact, his book, Contemporary Russian Cinema, Symbols of a New Era, has recently come out in paperback and is available for purchase at the university bookstore. So I hope you consider availing yourself of this opportunity, because there is actually no other book of its kind that is covering in depth and with this kind of provocative analysis what has been happening in Russian cinema recently. And Professor Stukov has been also a very important and influential figure in the study of Russian digital culture, Russian new media. He is, in fact, the founding and principal editor of an international open access online journal, Studies in Russian, Eurasian, and Central European New Media. You can find it at...
I'm just going to show it up, actually.
Yes, digitalicons.org.
Yeah, sorry, please go ahead. Yeah.
And so in his work, he touches such topics as intermediality and cultural theory, bringing them with theories of empire and nationhood, global journalism and grassroots media, and also theories of consumption and celebrity. So he co-edited a book on celebrity in contemporary Russian culture, for example. And in addition to his recent monograph, which originally came out in 2016, in the recent years, he also co-edited 3 volumes, which are Russian Aviation, Space, Flight, and Visual Culture, From Central to Digital Television in Russia, and New Media in New Europe and Asia. And he also has been doing a lot of really exciting work recently, thanks to a grant that he won together with a colleague from Sweden, Professor Maria Engström, Queer Visuality in Russia, and I presume that his talk today will be based on that, at least in part. So without further ado, I yield the floor to Vlad Stukov.
Thank you very much, Vitaly. Thank you, Vitaly, for that very generous introduction. I feel like also, can I live up to that? And thanks to everyone for coming today to this talk. The format for today's conversation is different, right? So I'm really glad that we're kind of all sitting together rather than me standing like I did yesterday, because I really want this to be a conversation about how we can actually conceptualize who we are in this sort of new digital age. I put up the journal homepage here because I wanted you to kind of see what it's like and possibly suggest that you can make use of it. We publish a lot of really interesting things. This is, for example, a list of our issues as they appeared over years. So we're looking at anything related to the convergence of media, such as, for example, computer gaming and film, to the study of how digital technologies were used in facilitating protest movements in Ukraine, Russia, Central Asia, elsewhere, etc. So it's a very, very diverse range of publications. But as I kind of conceived the journal over 10 years ago, we've always struggled with kind of really identifying where we are in relation to this concept of digital humanities, right? And what that it actually means. So I would be happy to talk about the trajectory of that field and where it's going later on during Q&A. But also I wanted to use the homepage here to tell you kind of about some difficulties we had with the most recent issue, and that probably would be my kind of way to get into the actual talk later. Let me just, it's a funny display here. It is this image that I wanted to kind of draw on. What does it look to you like? What do you think about it? Any thoughts, any reactions, anyone? Who would that be? Is this an appropriate image for a special issue on digital culture in Russia, do you think? We really struggled, the team of guest editors, and I was part of that, because it so happened that there were 4 people leading on the production of this issue, 3 female scholars and myself, a male scholar, right? So when I suggested this image, the whole kind of debate started about whether that was an appropriate representation of our work. And 2 out of those team, 2 women, they really kind of resisted the use of this image because they felt that that image stereotypes Russian people, presents them as a kind of masculine thug, etc., etc. So I withdrew from that discussion because as the kind of principal editor of the journal, I'm not taking part in that sort of debate, and I opened up to a team of people. And when we started talking about this image that actually was produced by a British artist, so it's actually a reflection on the situation in Great Britain 10 years ago. And I saw this image when I was at an exhibition of contemporary art in Finland. In other words, it had nothing to do with Russia, but I appropriated it and I kind of recontextualized it. I put it in the context of things evolving in Russia. And to me, it was important because it suggested a kind of a new transnational visuality of masculinity that is quite specific, as we can see here, quite raw, perhaps quite aggressive, with tattoos that say troll and whatnot, that has been kind of associated with Russia in recent years. And to me, it really mattered to show that it has a kind of a different resonance altogether. Most importantly, this image is actually not a photograph. It's an avatar that was a completely synthetic image that was produced by the artist from the UK in the same way as they would produce avatars in computer gaming. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is how that experience of playing computer games, of kind of, being online and seeing all kinds of things, how that actually impacts our understanding of identities and subjectivities and, again, who we are. And most importantly, this is where I'm going to switch to my kind of actual talk, is whether when we look at stuff, whether we can trace what it means and whether we can do that by using human capacity, in other words, researchers like ourselves, or whether we can use digital tools to do that as well. In other words, can we create a code that can look at this image and kind of provide that understanding that I just mentioned? I mean, can there be an algorithm that actually decodes all those meanings and can trace how this image evolved over time and how it's been used? So this is actually at the core of my discussion today. If I may, hold on a sec, what did I do here? It's doing this again. Does anyone know how to get rid of this prompt? Please, yeah.
If you just unclick that use presenter view box,
Oh, yeah.
you should get rid of it. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So that's the topic, right? The trauma of digital coming out, sexuality and social media in the Russian Federation. It's quite a loaded topic, I understand that. We'll see how much we can cover. But I developed this in relation to this project that Vitaly mentioned that is funded by the Swedish Academy of Research, but also in collaboration with scholars at the University of Amsterdam who work on digital trauma more generally. So there's a whole cluster of people there, including Mykola Makortych, who is a kind of Ukrainian scholar based in Amsterdam, and he works on the trauma of kind of working with digital media. What I'm interested in is whether, again, we can use algorithms, whether we can use sort of big data to analyze trauma as an experience, right? The difficulty with trauma, and we kind of started chatting about this earlier today, is that very often we are not aware of it, right? And that it's not displayed. It actually is not evident. It's not being phrased. And so I try to look at this process of coming out, which obviously refers to LGBT communities when they sort of announce to the world that they're gay, lesbian, whatever, as a way of this sort of shift from not being visible to being visible, right? And again, how tools, algorithms can be used to pick on that. Because, let me contextualize it in the kind of US context. As we know with Kevin Spacey, there is a different kind of a conflation of the issues of gender, sexual harassment, coming out, and digital tools, and what it means for people's careers and how they can be picked up. If we read the reports, the news reports about Kevin Spacey and similar cases, what we often feel is how the journalists are suggesting that those people should announce their sexuality to the world, that they're under some kind of pressure to say who they are. It's a new age of coming out to the world, not only from the point of view of sexuality, but any kind of ways, a sort of, kind of reaffirming who you are to the world. And I'm going to argue that in many ways, that has to do with the kind of the structure of social media, particularly Facebook, which offers certain categories, right? And we are supposed to identify ourselves in very specific ways. And to me, this is a sign of neoliberal capitalism, where algorithms benefit from knowing exactly who we are, right? And in a way, we are feeding our information to be used by coders, by those who work in big data. To me, this is a huge problem because, in a way, this is a return to structuralism, right? There are some kind of, as Vitaly said, young scholars here in the room. So let me kind of go through that very quickly so that you guys have a feeling of what it was like to work in the era kind of structuralism. That was the belief of that we can kind of identify structures and binary oppositions in everything, right? And that was the construction of that world that we then tried to dismantle in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and to move away from those binaries, to move a kind of a construction of multiplicity of fluid identities, of a world that was kind of transparent, perhaps not so evident and clearly categorized, right? And that was the project of the end of the 20th century, which in my personal view and history kind of produced a fantastic emancipatory result. We had greater freedoms of LGBT communities, we had great acceptance of women in workforce, and most importantly, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. So that, to me, that was the ultimate deconstruction of those binary oppositions. So here, although I work in digital humanities, I should say that I'm a huge skeptic of big data, because to me it reinforces that structuralist binary approach one more time, right? So I feel that we kind of went back to those times of binary thinking, and that is why you're either gay, like Kevin Spacey, or you're straight or something else, and that we're really worried about all kinds of fluid, indiscrete, non-evident processes. And those who are working in the Russian field would know that at the moment there's a kind of a construction going on of the Russian fear, right? A kind of a conspiracy, global conspiracy theory. And to me that is because we're afraid of those fluidities and we're kind of trying to represent them as fear. So what I'd like to show you next is a kind of a resistance to that return to structuralism, right? A suggestion that we can use digital humanities as a way to read digital contexts without categorizing it in binary terms. And so I really want to suggest a kind of a digital post-structuralism, if you wish. So that's the main kind of idea, the main impetus. But now let me go through some more concrete situation contexts. So trauma is a result of a transgressive action of all kinds. It can, for example, be an outcome of a difficult situation in life, such as, for example, an attack on a person or an accident of any kind. So it always comes at the end of that transgressive action, right? At the end of something kind of difficult moment. What I would like to argue is that trauma is actually part of that action, right? And that it continues afterwards, that it doesn't finish with the end of that process. And that very often trauma includes the kind of the coming out of the person, accepting that they had a traumatic experience and embracing it and then working through it. This is the way therapists work. This is the way, for example, US military works, where they have the facility where soldiers coming back from the war in Iraq would then sort of work through that through simulation machines and you name it. What I'm interested in is to suggest, by looking at the experience of LGBT communities, is that that trauma doesn't go away, that it stays with people all their life, and that actually turns into part of their identity, if you want. So I'm using here a couple of visuals. This one actually is Georgy Guryanov, who was a drummer in a Soviet rock band, Kino, that sort of was so instrumental in the 1990s. And then he became an artist, and he was a kind of an openly gay man in the Russian Federation. I'm just sort of suggesting that as a kind of a way to see what kind of masculinity was out there visually 20 years ago. And to me that resonates with the image that I showed earlier on. We also have all kinds of transgressive actions happening in the later period. So the image that we see here is a Russian artist, Mamoshev Monroe, who is known for impersonating all kinds of figures in cultural, political, social history. So he, for example, he impersonates Yulia Tymoshenko, right? At that time, I think a candidate for the Ukrainian presidency. So he kind of transgresses again all kinds of boundaries, sexual boundaries, gender boundaries, political boundaries, interstate boundaries, etc., etc. So I'm using those images and those histories to suggest that trauma and digital humanities have the capacity to influence experiences beyond individuals. We can look at states. We can look, for example, at the situation and conflict between Russia and Ukraine as a kind of a traumatic experience, and coming out and embracing who they are as a result of that. So what kind of research do we have on digital coming out, which is basically when people announce that they are, for example, transsexuals using social media. So there can be a person going online and saying openly that, you know, I'm gay or something like that. The research shows that it's actually a formal disclosure, because a person discloses their identity without getting any feedback, or kind of that they can ignore that feedback, or that feedback will be even more traumatic because they sometimes come back with a lot of abuse. And that experience is radically different from coming out in the non-digital arena, where that includes kind of a person-to-person communication and confrontations of a different kind. what I've observed by looking at digital media around the world is that digital coming out has turned into some kind of a media genre, that there are particular kind of ways of doing it, that there's an aesthetic of digital coming out, that you do it in particular. You set up the camera in a certain way, you post your video in a particular place, that it's all come as a kind of a genre, as I said. If we try to analyze how trauma works here, we see sort of different stages of it, and this is a kind of a scheme that I try to develop in my work. So what we have is that there are different kinds of traumas. There's trauma A, and that is the realization of a person that they're different from the rest, right? In a way, it is trauma from the fear of possible discrimination, and that is before the person actually acknowledges to the world who they are. And then we have the moment of coming out. That is in the pre-digital age. What we have now is the digital coming out that happens afterwards, where the Facebook newsline can kind of bounce back with the news of somebody coming out again, again, and again. It's a kind of an ongoing construction and an opportunity to link up two different communities with similar processes. And then there is the trauma from self-disclosure that comes with that as well. And so it's a kind of a very complex process, but those are the stages, A, B, and a kind of a different B that comes with digital coming out. Is there coming out in Russia, right? I put up this question kind of ironically, but also seriously, because I'm always asked when I travel around the world about what's going on in Russia, and people are familiar with this new legislation that came out in 2014, the so-called gay propaganda law, right? Which is, as we know, is a wrong translation of the actual piece of legislation, because the item is that there should be no propaganda of any non-traditional sexual activities, which is a very kind of a loose category and may include anything really, any kind of sexual activity whatsoever. So in a way, in a very affirmative way, I want to say that yes, there are people who come out in Russia on the public arena, and I chose those two images to illustrate that. So on your right, you have a video that was posted on YouTube of a young woman who came out as a lesbian. And again, I want to use this as an example of that digital genre of coming out, of a particular setup of the camera, of the choice of the background, etc., etc. The proximity of the speaker to the camera is very important. It's very often a close-up. People come very close to the camera to kind of suggest that intimacy of sharing the information that is out there. But if we look at this image critically, we can also see how this process is very much staged, right? The perfect hair, the perfect background, etc., etc. So it's a performance, the purpose of which is not really to talk to the people about their experience and their sexual identity, but rather really to stage a particular kind of a moment. And so here trauma kind of works in a funny way, because trauma may come from even members of the LGBT community who resist that kind of a commercial form of coming out. On the left, we've got a different example of that sort of a process, where a young man comes out to the world as a gay man. You will notice that he talks about his sexuality here in English and in Russian as well, right? And what he says there is that he's a gay man, and that you can also link up to his webcam and observe him while he's masturbating, right? So here, that sort of coming out is linked up with commercial activity as such, and then there are questions about the intention here as well. We also have very much formal kind of processes of coming out. This is a view of a political show that ran on Russian television in 2013, when the guy who is in the middle Krasovsky, came out. He announced that he was gay, right? And this is one of the moments when sort of we kind of see that. Now, there's another kind of element here that I wanted to reflect on, and that is in the West, particularly in the Western media, there is a construction of LGBT communities in Russia or Poland or elsewhere in Ukraine as people with a kind of a liberal outlook, right? And that is precisely how Krasovsky wants to come out in this particular process. In other words, coming out as a homosexual in a way guarantees his perception as a liberal. But what is interesting here is that the program where this happened was actually sponsored by ultra-wing conservatives in Putin administration, where he worked as a kind of a news anchor, which really challenges our assumptions about how certain identities and communities work. And to me, that is already a political interpretation of trauma of that sort of visuality. There are some fantastic initiatives out there, like this one, for example, in St. Petersburg, where there is a support network for individuals who came out, but particularly those who work with their parents, right? So the trauma then is spread around to include other communities as well. So this is a YouTube channel where people talk about where parents talk about their experience of their children coming out, right? So it's a kind of an online support system where you can kind of log in and listen to, for example, a mother talking about her son and how he came out and what it meant to her. This is a kind of a positive example. There's a negative example that I don't want to visualize that we know very well. If we move from St. Petersburg all the way to the south to Chechnya, we know that there was a process of extreme discrimination of gay men there. You know the story very well, so I don't want to talk about this. But what I kind of figure out very recently in my research is that digital technologies were actually extremely important in that process because in a way they facilitated the abuse of gay men in that region because they were used as a way to track those men in the region. And so one of my co-researchers, she's a wonderful lady from the region, she told me, for example, that at the moment, if you're in North Caucasus in the Russian Federation, and if you go to gay dating sites, there is actually a note telling you not to use them there because it is perceived as a kind of a threat. Now, let me kind of remind you where we started to show what is this all about. The question is, when we have those algorithms, when we have the big data, can we really collect information about things that we do not see, right? Things that are invisible to us in many ways. And how do we then make sure that when we use those technologies, that they do not produce a very negative effect on the communities in certain contexts, right? How do we make sure that Grindr or similar gay dating website should not be used by authoritative kind of regimes in those particular regions to track and abuse individuals there, right? That is the big question. And if people go off their head, how do then we conduct our research in relation to those communities? If we pull back from the whole kind of LGBTQ context, I think there are many examples of information that is still not available for that sort of data harvesting. But if we look at the most cited publications globally, what we will see is that they're based on that sort of data research. Lev Manovich, a very prominent professor of digital humanities, just published a book about a month ago on visualities on Instagram, right, where they used billions of photographs to analyze certain trends in different parts of the world. So when he and I met a month ago, I asked him, but what about all those people who did not place their selfies on the internet, who don't have smartphones, who live in areas that have no access to digital technologies? How do you claim that these are global trends if you did not include all those who remain invisible, right? So that is a kind of a challenge there. I'm going to give you one more example, and probably we'll open up for questions, because I'd rather kind of do this as a conversation, probably draw on other things in my work, than continue kind of this in the mode of the lecture. So here I wanted to show you another example of this digital coming out, with the view of suggesting that there is a global connection, that there is a kind of a global feedback loop, and how things travel beyond national borders in very interesting ways. So this is a very, very powerful individual who lives in Russia, Igor Siniak. That is his actual name. It kind of sounds funny in Russian, but it's at the same time really cool. So he's a makeup artist who posts videos with advice on how to use makeup, right? And they're kind of structured in that sort of binary logic before and after that we see from all those international television formats. Let me point out something. It is, at the time when I took the screen grab, he had almost 500,000 views, right? Oops. If we look at this one, for example, where it's the support network for parents, it's just 22,000 views, right? So that commercial consumption aspect is also very important. Igor Siniak did not acknowledge that he is gay publicly, but I think we may safely assume that he is, right? And then if we read his interviews, it kind of comes across as such. So it's, again, the algorithms would not pick on him as a kind of a data sample, because he never said that openly, so there'll be no tools to identify that. At the same time, he's part of the global corporate structure because he collaborates with global makeup companies and basically promotes their products using his videos there. And where we have the global connection is that obviously we have, for example, American makeup artists who do similar work online, like Patrick Starr here, right? Who does exactly the same. It's a kind of a combination of before and after visuals. And again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that this video had almost exactly the same number of views as the Russian one. So again, if I were to use my wonderful algorithms to assess what's going on in the Russian Federation, I would probably come back with the result that there's very little activity in terms of LGBT communities because it remains invisible. It will probably bounce back with a feeling of that there is a very high level of discrimination, that people don't have a way to voice their identities, etc. But in actual terms, if you use contextual digital reading, you actually see a very different result, like over here. That in many ways, it is parallel to what we see elsewhere. It's just that it works in ways that we don't have the tools to analyze if we were to apply big data. So I'm just going to finish here and open up for discussion, questions of all kinds, and kind of to say that really that project of post-structuralism that we had in the 1990s, in the 1980s, was incredibly important because it taught us how to read identities and cultures through contextual interpretation. If we look at Judith Butler, if we look at Homi Bhabha of that period, if we look at all of those key scholars of that time who looked at the issues of race, gender, sexuality, you name it, they all taught us how to read contextually, how to engage with communities, how to look at the context. And sadly, what big data is doing is kind of forcing us, compelling us not to do it, to kind of survey rather than to engage, to hover above, but not really to have a zoom in and kind of actually see what's happening there. And to me, that is a very, very difficult and challenging moment, because I fear that it will create a kind of a misconception of actually what's going on in the world. So I'm going to, on this profound note, I'm going to finish up here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.